Welcome to the recorded webinar on the Missouri First Steps Individualized Family Service Plan, IFSP Meeting Observation Tool. This webinar is intended to provide instruction on how to administer the IFSP Meeting Observation Tool, as well as offer an overview of each essential practice identified. Before we begin, DESE staff in the First Steps Early Intervention Program would like to thank the following individuals for their feedback and guidance during the development of this tool. SPO directors and providers on the Program Improvement Work Group, Sherry Franklin, Technical Assistant Specialist, the Early Childhood Technical Assistance ECTA Center, Ann Lucas, Technical Assistant Specialist, the Early Childhood Technical Assistance ECTA Center, and Debbie Schraver, PhD, Evaluation Specialist, IDA Center. To begin, it is important to have a baseline understanding of what this observation tool will provide to the field of early intervention in Missouri. Observation tools not only identify core components with specific observational practices, but it should also serve as a way for feedback to be shared, followed by reflection and follow-up TA or training. Thinking about observation tool in this way lends itself to sustainability of practices within the field. Evidence-based practice in the field of early childhood is the process of pulling together the best available research, knowledge from the professionals, and information from children and their caregivers to provide services evaluated and proven to achieve positive outcomes for children and families. Practices identified within this observation tool align with several evidence-based sources, including the agreed upon practices for providing early intervention services in natural environments and the recommended practices developed by the Division for Early Childhood, DEC. As First Steps strives to improve outcomes for children and families, looking closer at practices and interactions with families within the program provides a direct correlation. It's important to keep in mind the purpose of this tool is to examine practices, discussions, and interactions during an IFSP meeting, not rate how the IFSP document was written. The observation tool is designed using a 4-point rating scale. Utilizing a rating for identified practices allows for a baseline measurement to be established and can be used to subsequent observations as applicable to determine progress made. When observations are conducted by multiple people, inter-rater reliability is critical to ensure consistency in use of the tool, which ultimately leads to more accurate data related to early intervention practices in Missouri. Now let's take a look at the instructions for using the IFSP meeting observation tool. The instructions can be found on page 1 of the observation tool and begins with an explanation of the purpose of the tool. The First Steps Individualized Family Service Plan Meeting Observation Tool is designed to measure the use of evidence-based practices during the IFSP meeting. The intention of the observation tool is to examine the interactions, discussions, overall tone of the IFSP meeting, not to serve as a script for conversations during the IFSP meeting. The tool can be used to observe service coordinator and provider practices during IFSP meetings to help identify the need for targeted technical assistance or additional training. The tool also assists the Regional System Point of Entry, SPO directors, with annual needs assessment. The needs assessment identifies the strengths, challenges, and any related training and technical assistance in the region based on observations of service coordinator activities. Observation data is submitted annually to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education as part of the State Systemic Improvement Plan, reported to the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education. As you think about the layout of the observation tool, you might envision a funnel looking at each section from the top-down perspective. The observation tool consists of 4 essential IFSP meeting practices. 1, establish and maintain a collaborative and respectful climate. 2, prioritize the family's concerns. 3, determine IFSP outcomes. And 4, prepare the family for next steps. The essential practices are the overarching concept for the tool, represented at the top of the funnel. Each essential practice identifies 3 or 4 observable components necessary to achieve the essential practice, represented in the middle of the funnel. Lastly, each observable component has 3 or 4 key indicators that specify the EBP, which explains or promotes, in parentheses, represented at the bottom of the funnel. The procedures provided in the instructions describe the intended use of the IFSP meeting observation tool. The observation tool is intended to be used in its entirety during the first observation of the initial 6-month or annual IFSP meeting. However, each essential practice may be used and scored independently for follow-up observations. Due to the amount of compliance-driven activities that must take place during a transition IFSP, it is not recommended this observation tool be used during a transition IFSP meeting. The tool utilizes a 4-point scale for each observable component. The observer selects one rating per component based on the level in which all key indicators are consistently implemented and, when applicable, demonstrating throughout the meeting. You will notice there is no not applicable options when rating each observable component. Providing NA can often lead to messy scoring and can also signal that the observable component is not diverse enough to meet the intended observation audience or meeting type. Therefore, it was decided during the design of the tool that NA would not be an option for observers. A key feature to this tool is the flexibility it provides to observers. The essential practice do not have to be observed or scored in an order indicated in the tool. Because there is no set script to use for conducting an IFSP meeting, and because the tone of the meeting should be family friendly, the observer may find themselves observing and scoring the practices out of order that they are provided in the tool. A notes section provides a place to write comments about the observations that are supporting the ratings. The First Steps IFSP meeting observation tool was developed with information from the following sources: the agreed upon practices, which were developed in 2008 by the work group on principles and practices in natural environment through OSIP. The 7 key principles, looks like, doesn't look like, was developed in 2008, also by the work group on principles and practices in the natural environment. The recommended practices developed by the Division of Early Childhood, and the Reaching Potentials Through Recommended Practices Observation Scale from Home Visiting, developed by the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center. Now let's take a closer look at each of the 4 essential practices. Essential Practice 1 is establish and maintain a collaborative and respectful climate for all IFSP team members, including the family. There are 4 observable components under Essential Practice 1. Those are: explain the purpose and process of the IFSP meeting with all members, share information with all team members in a clear manner, use active and reflective listening skills, facilitate the IFSP meeting to include the family as an equal team member. As you can see, Essential Practice number 1 has an emphasis on facilitating skills and overall climate of the meeting. Because of this, you will see specific examples of engaging the family throughout the meeting using active listening skills, reiterating what the family knows about the child, as well as how to acknowledge and validate the family's perspective. One theme you will notice throughout all the essential practices is the continual looping back around to the family's concerns and priorities, making that the primary focus of the IFSP conversation. This tool assumes the family assessment was already conducted and concerns, priorities, resource information have already been discussed. Essential Practice number 1 reflects the importance of coming back to those by explaining how the IFSP process should reflect those CPRs and how the end result of the meeting should be identified of services. As mentioned previously, this observation tool allows for flexibility in the order in which observations of specific observable components may occur, as well as scoring. This is essential evidence in Essential Practice number 1. Observable component A includes indicators specific to the beginning of an IFSP meeting, while observable components B through D include indicators requiring demonstration of the indicator throughout the IFSP meeting. Observable components B through D have a strong emphasis on quality interactions, climate, tone, and discussions that occur inconclusively with all team members, and most importantly, the family, and making sure they are active participants in the conversation throughout the meeting. For example, providing opportunities for all team members to participate in the discussion, checking for clarification, not using jargon. All of these would be expectations of the climate throughout the meeting, not just the beginning. That is why the last indicator for components B through D states, demonstrate these indicators throughout the IFSP meeting. If those active listening skills and participation for everyone is not presented through the entire meeting, the observation might receive a 3 on those particular components instead of a 4. Again, this type of observation reflects how this is not a linear tool. Just because these components are in Essential Practice 1 doesn't mean you will rate them first. Essential practice number 2 is prioritize the family's concerns, considering child and family assessment information. There are 3 observable components under essential practice number 2. Those are synthesize the information collected regarding the child's present level of development, review the update the concerns shared by the family, identify the family's priorities related to the child and family needs. The emphasis of essential practice number 2 is on review of information gained from the intake meeting, the evaluation, or the assessments, as well as from the family assessment and how that review leads to prioritizing the family's concerns. Essential practice number 2 begins with a look at the child's present levels and the impact those have on the child's daily routines and activities. Additionally, essential practice number 2 begins with a review of all the information related to child's development and health to ensure the team has all the information needed to move forward. Again, the tool is flexible, so the observer might need to jump around and score items as they occur naturally throughout the course of the discussion. This is very important to remember because we know conversations with families can go so many different ways depending on many factors. This observation tool should not force a conversation, but rather reflect the journey of the discussions and interactions that occur amongst all team members throughout the IFSP meeting. In essential practice number 2, the importance of the family's CPRs are again reflected in the observable components. B offers time to review both the child and family concerns, and the team has time to learn of any new concerns that the family might have. Again, when used during an initial IFSP meeting, this tool assumes the family assessment has already taken place. The examples provided in C lend themselves to the observer, looking from how the team connects those priorities to how the family will be active participants in early intervention process and services. When you hear things like, what goals do you have in mind for your child? Or are there things you want to do that you can't do? Or are there things you are already doing that you need help with? It sends the message of how important it is to pull the parent into the discussion and helps them see that these are their concerns and this is how the team will help them with their concerns. The examples within each key indicator of essential practice number 2 are really getting to know the family feels empowered during the meeting and how the entire team is backing them. Essential practice number 3 is determine IFSP outcomes for the child and family considering the family's priorities. There are 3 observable components under essential practice number 3. Those are identify and revise outcomes for the child and family that are functional, identify or revise strategies and activities to support the identified functional outcomes, identify and or revise the criteria for determining progress towards achieving outcomes. Essential practice number 3 has an emphasis on the discussion of the family's priorities that lead to outcomes. Remember, this observation tool is not about how outcomes are written, but rather those discussions around how outcomes get identified. During the development of the observation tool, particularly with A, it became evident that the examples of how you identify functional outcomes in an IFSP discussion really focused around the definition of functional outcomes. Functional outcomes should 1, connect to priorities, 2, build on what the team knows about the child's present levels. And 3, support participation in naturally occurring routines. You will notice the key indicators provided in A were built around those defining pieces. Observable component B is unique because strategies and activities, although an important piece of an IFSP team discussion, are also an optional piece in the IFSP document itself. Therefore, the emphasis around what those strategies and activities discuss typically circles around. That is why the key indicators for B put more emphasis on how the discussion should identify the people, places, and things that will support those functional outcomes. Observable component C reflects on the IFSP team discussion around measurement of criteria for determining progress to achieving the IFSP outcome. Those discussions should be realistic for the family and again, circle back around to the priorities identified by the family. The last essential practice is number 4. Prepare the family for early intervention services and next steps. There are 3 observable components under essential practice number 4. Those are identify services and supports necessary to achieve the identified outcomes, identify next steps in preparation for services to begin or continue, identify next steps in planning for outcome IFSP meetings. Observable component A is about the discussion of services and supports necessary to achieve the identified outcomes. The key indicators not only allow for how the team identifies what the family needs, but also takes into account what they might already have in place. Observable component A also gets into identifying who the primary provider will be and whether or not additional supports will be needed to assist the primary provider. To some degree, the observation would see evidence within the meeting of the incremental approach to decision-making being used by the team members as part of the discussion around how outcomes will be achieved and by whom. Observable component B and C round out essential practice number 4, with ensuring everyone on the team is familiar with the next steps for services and for upcoming IFSP meetings. Those 2 components provide examples of what the observation might look like for within the conversations and making sure everyone is on the same page with moving forward and everyone's responsibilities. The last page of the IFSP meeting observation tool are the references for essential practices in each observable component. This reference shows you not only where the information was pulled for each essential practice during the development of the tool, but it can also serve as a point of reference for follow-up or technical assistance that might be needed when challenging practices are identified. For example, if the observer scores a 2 under essential practice number 1, A, then the observer knows there is information to support further learning in that area. In the agreed upon practices number 2, 7 key principles number 4, and within the DECA RP team and collaboration checklist. Thank you for your time. Questions regarding information presented in the webinar can be directed to the contact information provided on this slide. This concludes the webinar presentation on First Steps IFSP Meeting Observation Tool.